So we're returning now to content that's more in the middle of chapter 1, and I'm hoping to pick up the pace just a little bit. Not that I need to rush it, but just I think these things are a bit more clear and I can go a little bit more quickly over them, but still some things I want to both emphasize and to clarify from what the textbook says about them. So I wanted to look at the section on the principles of communication, and the principles the book goes over are just fine, but there are a couple I want to spend, as I say, just another minute or two with. So one of the things the book says is that communication is ambiguous. Right. So part of it is language can be very ambiguous. If you think about the word often, how often is often? If you ask somebody, how often do you exercise? Well, often could mean every day, a couple times a week, just once a week, right? Maybe once every other week they consider often because they used to do none at all, right? Often can be pretty vague. Big, so you say, how big of a problem is it? Oh, it's a big problem. Well, what does that mean it's a big problem, right? So language can be ambiguous. And so this is one of the challenges. Again, if we go back to that communication model, we think about encoding and decoding. Language can be ambiguous, that what we mean by something, what people take away from it, doesn't always line up, right? Doesn't, because it's sort of ambiguous, like there's that fuzziness, and we just don't really know. So language can be ambiguous. Relationships can also be ambiguous in terms of there's everything from what goes on when we're dating with, are we friends? Are we more than friends? Is this a casual thing? Are we serious? Excuse me, we have that sort of relationship ambiguity. But you can have ambiguity in your work relationships, right? So does your boss really want to hear your feedback, right? And sees you as they know you're their boss, but they also treat you a lot like a peer. Do they mean that, or do they really see a strong sense of they're here and you're, lower, you're down there? So that relationship ambiguity. And so a supervisor says, I'm really interested in your opinions and your thoughts. And you think, well, am I supposed to give it to you like unvarnished, as they say, like straight, or do I need to pad it, right? There's that relationship ambiguity. And so sometimes it's, again, things can be ambiguous, language can be ambiguous, but also that relationship status can be ambiguous rather. And so that means we're not sure how to convey and how to receive certain messages, right? So that's one of the principles of communication. Another principle of communication, and this is huge, is that communication involves content and relationship dimensions. And I gotta say, DeVito has published this book for a long time, and at this point, there's something DeVito says about this that I gotta say, as a researcher in gender, doesn't actually hold up to scrutiny. We're going to talk about that. So communication involves content and relationship dimensions. Absolutely. If there's really not much else you get out of this class, well, I want to get a lot of things out of this class, but there's not much else you get. If you could just get every message has a content and a relational component. If you get that, you will drastically change how you communicate to others. Just recognizing that every message has content to it. The words I'm saying, the thing I'm trying to accomplish. Just what we often think of as the meaning I want to give to you, right? That's the content. But there's this relationship dimension, which establishes how do I understand our relationship, what we are to each other. And so DeVito makes this comment that men focus more on content and women more on relational messages that really doesn't hold up for a lot of reasons. So first let's talk about let's go back to your childhood or to your adolescence, really. And if you think about, and maybe this wasn't you, but you came home and there was the adult there and they say, how was your day? You say, well, fine, right? So the content is fine. You're saying it wasn't good, wasn't bad. It was, fine. Okay. And it doesn't mean you use a nasty tone. Fine, or what you just say, oh, it was fine. If that's always the response, relationally, what that conveys to a person is, I'm not letting you in, right? Even if we think about the sort of supermarket exchange of, hi, how are you? Oh, I'm fine, thanks. How are you? Fine, thanks. Right? So the content's pretty clear, right? I'm asking how you're doing. You convey you're fine, okay? Relationally, part of what we're establishing by relying on that very sort of patterned thing of how are you? I'm fine, thanks. How are you? Fine, thanks. By relying on that, it says our relationship is just, surface. There's no depth to it. We're just, just surface. There's nothing really special or meaningful or unique about this relationship as we're conveying there, right? And part of the reason I say that this is sort of bogus, that men don't think about relational messages, um, is it to say, I mean, that men aren't aware of what goes on in friendships and romantic relationships and familiar relationships is a problem, but also it dismisses the fact that in the workplace, for instance, and I talked about this with, in terms of social psychological context to messages, right? That when you go to a supervisor and you say, all right, well, I'm going to take off a few minutes early, see you tomorrow, and you walk out, that says in a relationship that you feel you have equal footing with them, right? Or that you feel free to walk in their office and say, I can't believe the schedule you made up. It makes no sense at all. Okay, that is a statement. I mean, it talks about you're complaining about the schedule not being good. It's the content. But relationally, what you're saying is, I am perfectly empowered to tell you exactly what I feel, and I don't have to mind the consequences of it, right? That's a relational dimension. So every message has content and relational messages, right? And so that's always something that we're sorting out, and that can be very culturally dependent, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit here. But yeah, but every message has a content and a relational component. That you share somebody with something lets them know that you feel that you can be open with them. You might be at work and a supervisor shares something with you about a struggle going on within the company. You think, wow, they really trust me to confide in me. There might be times they share with you and you think, why are you doing that? I don't want the burden of that information. I don't want to know you're going to fire somebody, or I don't know about your personal life because we're not becoming friends. Whereas other times you might be glad that somebody at work or elsewhere shares something because it lets you know that you're becoming friends, right? So communication always involves, with every message, a content and a relational dimension, and it is hugely important to understand. I hope that is very clear. Another principle of communication, and there's 3 points here, right? The first, communication is inevitable. We cannot not communicate. Silence is communication. So here's a quick story, and sorry, it's a personal rather than a professional one, I guess. When my son was born, my son is Grant. When my son was born, I called my mom and I told him he'd been born. He was born in the wee hours of the morning, and I said, "You want?" So she asked, like, "What's his name?" Or I told her, I said, "Hey, I'll tell you his name," and I said, "His name is Grant," and there was this silence. Right? That she didn't immediately say, oh, wonderful, or great name, or sounds good, or aces, anything at all. There was a silence. That silence is communicating something. And I have to decode that. Like, what do I, sort of what meaning am I bringing to that silence, right? And then she said, yeah, that's a good name. So for my mom, that silence meant she was not going to give me great name just no matter. She has to really think, do I like that name? That, by the way, is my parents and how I was raised. You did not blindly get praise. You had to earn it, right? It's so, but still, that silence, though, was communicating something about, well, this isn't just going to be blind praise. I got to think about this, right? So communication is inevitable. We can't help not communicate. It's just, it's part of it. Even if you're in a room with somebody and they 30 seconds later, right? Obviously, they're communicating something, and you trying to ignore them as communicating. I'm trying to ignore you. I'm not, right? It's sort of inevitable, right? Communication is irreversible. Once we say those things, we can't take them back, which we've all learned very painfully many times. One time, I had an immediate supervisor write a very unkind email directed at me, other people copied on it, and saying, this is not acceptable, this cannot happen, I should have had this already. I replied saying, please see attached a copy of the email I sent last week with the information you had requested. The reply I got to that was, thank you, please disregard my previous email. Oh, Or maybe it was I take back or disregard. Oh, is that a thing now? Do we just like reverse messages? Like, of course not. Because, by the way, you already conveyed that information that you didn't like something, and that, right, that was the content, and then relationally, you already conveyed to me how little you thought of me, right? And it's irreversible. The die has been cast. So communication is irreversible. Also, communication is unrepeatable. If we go back to the great Greek historian Heraclitus, who says, let's see, you cannot step twice into the same river, for other waters are ever flowing. Right? So think about that, right? You can never step twice in the same stream. Even like at a molecular level, right? There's always different little molecules of the water flowing past, going to rush across your foot as you step into it. But also, even if you have the same exchange again, it's never really going to be the new, because part of it is, why are we doing this again? Or this feels comforting. Let me give you a personal example. My daughter likes two things, apparently. She really likes popsicles, and two, she likes leaving the stick and wrapper stuck in the cushions of the couch. Uh, and so, I say, Eleanor, you left your popsicle stick, in the wrapper at least, it's not like sticking to the couch, on the couch again. Or on the couch. You throw it away. Okay, sorry. All right, that's the first time. Jump to 48 hours later, and I'm saying this again. Oh, okay, sorry. The next day, the same interaction again. It's not, this is not actually truly a repeated interaction, even if we have the same words, because as I'm hearing it, I'm thinking, the first time I thought maybe you were sorry. The second time is like you're struggling with it. The third time, you don't care. You just say sorry to shut me up, right? It's not repeatable because each instance is unique. If for another reason, then think about that temporal relationship of messages we talked about, right? This I'm sorry is following the other 18 I'm sorries for the same thing that I've heard before. So I'm thinking you don't mean it at all, right? So communication is not repeatable. It's right. It's not a repeatable thing. That movie you watched, you laughed at the first time. You watch it again to laugh at it again. Part of it is it's also comforting to go back to that thing that you're watching again, right? So communication is not repeatable. Now, as we move from principles of communication to culture and communication, some important things to talk about, right? So, defining culture. The book says culture consists of beliefs, ways of behaving, and artifacts of a group. And we think about beliefs sometimes, we just think in like religious beliefs. But think about beliefs of cultures in the sense of like the things that happen. Are they the cause of your own doing, or the things that happen to you? How easy is it for you to overcome your circumstance? Is just hard work going to get you over your circumstance, or there are certain barriers which require assistance to overcome great barriers before you? Those are beliefs, and those are cultural beliefs, right? That can be affected by age, by class, by race and ethnicity, so on and so forth, right? Ways of behaving in culture, right? Think about especially in terms of communication. Ways of behaving. When is it okay to be loud and rambunctious, and when is it not? In some cultures, it's never okay to do that. In some places, in others, it is. If you think about, in movie theaters, about whether you're supposed to sit quietly and occasionally laugh, or do you say, "Oh my gosh, can you believe that?" Right? That way of behaving, that's a culture-dependent sort of thing, right? It varies by culture, perhaps, right? And then also the artifacts of a group. Flags, emblems, pieces of dress, right? Those are all pieces of culture. But within every culture, there's great variation. If somebody said to you, and I'm going to assume you're from Tennessee, not all of you are from Tennessee, but bear with me here. I'm not from Tennessee, right? But if somebody says you're from here, knows that you're from Tennessee or wherever you're from, I'm from California, and says, "Oh, well, then yeah, I know yeah, you all do blank." You think we don't all do that. And even maybe something I do, but no, we don't all do that. So you know what I mean. So there's always variation within cultures. And so we can't just look at the culture somebody is from, whether it is regional, racial, ethnic, it is sexual, it is religious, and assume we know everything, right? Oh, you are, name the religious beliefs. I'll use my own, Christian. I practice the Christian faith. Oh, so that means that you blank, you believe in blank. Not necessarily, my so you just can't assume based on my status as a Christian what it is that means that I believe about the roles of men and women, we'll say, or issues of sexuality and so on and so forth. You don't know that automatically. So there's always a lot of variation within cultures. You got to keep yourself open-minded. And part of that, gender is also a key cultural variable. And part of that is, and going back to what the book says here, that what is expected of men and women varies tremendously by culture. So a culture may value certain things, and it may value it differently among men and among women, right? So dominant U.S. culture values clarity and forthrightness, but has a tendency to respect it and accept it more in men and respond a little more negatively to it in women. There's research on this. I teach gender and communications, so that's where I'm coming from with this, that tells us, for instance, that men are sort of expected to brag in job interviews. If they don't, that seems odd, but women bragging in job interviews is seen as unseemly. Right. So the idea of self-confidence yourself is an important part of sort of dominant U.S. culture, but then that varies even by our expectations of men and women. And I turn to this graphic or this figure that comes from your book. It is a communication model. Don't worry, not going to go. Don't worry, not going to go over it again with you. But I like the fact that it reminds us that as we're involved in encoding and decoding, we're always culturally situated by where we were raised, how we were raised, the beliefs that we were taught, and not just about beliefs like you should be nice to people, which is actually more of a value, but beliefs about, are people naturally good or naturally bad? When people have struggles, it's just because they're lazy. Those cultural things affect the encoding and decoding of messages and how we're going to convey things and how we're going to receive things. And just think about how culture impacts that and the challenges that can create, and also the opportunity for us to expand the way that we think about things. All right, moving on from that, I want to talk about some key dimensions of culture. Your book talks about each of these. I'm going to go over them sort of briefly here and try to touch on also just where does dominant U.S. culture, the U.S. has a lot of variance in it, but where does the U.S. sort of land on those dimensions? So the masculinity, femininity dimension of culture, that is the traits, and it's sort of a slippery one to get at, but the traits that we think of as masculine, assertiveness, competitiveness versus cooperation and care as being more feminine. That's really sort of hard saying one's masculine, one's feminine for a lot of reasons, but that's what we mean by that. So the U.S., how do we shake out? Well, out of the 76 countries that were surveyed, with 1 being the most masculine and 76 being the most feminine in terms of what is valued, the United States is number 19, which is more masculine. That is, values the traits that are seen as more masculine, competitiveness, assertiveness, right, and so forth, right? I mean, yeah, so that's part of the U.S. culture, but that's what we mean by masculine and femininities. The cultural orientations are those traits that we in the U.S. think of as masculine and feminine. So very sort of problematic scale, but there it is. So high and low context cultures, how important is the context to understanding the message? Does everything have to be said, right, actually articulated? How much of it comes from the context of it all to understand the message? So the U.S. is a fairly low context culture. By low context culture, what it means is that when we speak to each other, we don't rely much on the context for understanding what a person means. We rely on the words, right? So it's very much the words. And so if somebody at your place of employment says, we've had a lot of problems lately with people being late, so I'm going to put you in charge of working with your colleagues to make sure everybody's getting here on time. You think, oh, okay, there's a problem with them being late. They trust me to talk to people about getting here on time. In a high context culture, that may mean you are not very good about getting here on time, so I'm putting you in charge of it so you'll reform yourself, right? The context may inform those words very differently. for how we should decode them. So high and low context, how much we rely upon the words and how much do other factors about the context we're in help me understand what it is you're trying to say. A long and short-term orientation, right? Do people operate more on what's gonna, be the best sort of right now, today, tomorrow, versus what's gonna be good in a year, in a decade, in a generation? Overall, the U.S. is fairly short term in its orientation on a scale. I'm going to check my numbers here. On a scale of 95, 95 being the shortest term orientation and 1 being the longest term, we're at a 69. So we're fairly short term orientation. So if you want to sell people something on doing something, saying it will be of great benefit to future generations, that argument sounds nice, but people in this country don't respond to that as well as how you'll benefit for it this year. So put solar panels on your house, you'll start seeing savings in your electric bill starting the first year is a much more compelling argument in this country than what it's going to do for your children and their children. Right, so we have a more of a short-term orientation here, and that affects the sorts of messages that are going to be persuasive. Right? Indulgence and restraint, how much do we feel like we should just, if you want it, do it. I remember my dad's best friend told me one time, Wesley, if it feels good, do it. A statement which my father felt was important to immediately reverse, actually, and say, don't do that, right? It's the idea of indulgence. If it feels good, just go ahead and do it. That's indulgence versus restraint, which is, now rethink this, right? By the way, the man giving that advice, his marriage did not work well for him because he had a tendency to indulge his penchant for dating the nurses he worked with. All right, so indulgence versus restraint, and when we look at that, so for one being most indulgent, if it feels good, do it. If you want it, buy it, eat it, drink it, whatever. Indulgent, that's number 1. 93 is you probably don't need to restrain yourself. We're a 15. We're a 15 out of 93, so we're a fairly indulgent culture, just dominant U.S. culture. But there's a lot of pockets within the U.S., but generally speaking, the U.S., if you look at our advertising, it tells you we're pretty indulgent. And the fact that we can't help want to go out to bars and restaurants, we should be isolating, we're sort of indulgent. We got some issues. Okay. Power distance. This is about how comfortable do we feel and how much do we respect that power distance, which is it's a metaphor of distance, the distance between you and people in authority. So we talk a lot in U.S. politics about the people we're voting for and whether or not they seem like someone we'd want to have a beer with or get to know or talk to. That tells you that we are a low power distance culture, generally speaking. By the way, on high 76, on a high is a 1, low is a 76, low power distance. We're at 59 out of 76, so that's the bottom, about quarter there, I guess. We don't want to feel, a big sense of a distance between us and those who are our superiors, right? And so we see think about other cultures where you might bow right to a person of like your leader, your monarch, right? We're pretty low, right? The idea of bowing to somebody in our culture, like a leader, you know what I mean? Seems very odd. There are cultures where you bow to friends. That is part of the cultural practice. But yeah, we have a pretty low power distance. We don't want to have a great distance between each other. We want to sort of feel like we can connect with them. So we're a low power distance culture. Yeah, we don't want to feel that the people above us are too far away from us. And then individualism versus collectivism. We are a strongly individualistic culture. We think about things and how they'll benefit us and not the collective. So we think about this job and the respect this job will get me and how much money will it make for me, and not if I have this job, how will that reflect upon my family? How will it reflect upon my cultural group? Right? We don't think about that often. In the general U.S. culture, we think about how it's going to affect, how are people going to look at us? If we are embarrassed, we worry about how we've embarrassed ourselves, not how we've embarrassed our family or the people who are related to us or whom we work with. right? So we're a highly individualistic culture versus collectivistic. So those are those key dimensions of culture. Right. Oh, I'm sorry. Another one is uncertain. This is the last one. This one for reals is the last one, and it's uncertainty avoidance. How do we feel about not knowing what's going to happen next? This is a low uncertainty avoidance culture. We do not like ambiguity in this culture. 76 being the least tolerant for ambiguity, 1 being the most tolerant for ambiguity. We're at 64 out of 76. We do not like ambiguity in our culture. We don't want to be in situations where we're uncertain of things. We want to know what the answer is and not, well, we'll have to wait and see and write it out. We want to know what the answer is. We harshly judge people who change their mind because we think they're not certain, as opposed to seeing them as being open to changing information, right? So that's those are some key dimensions of culture. Right. And now the last we're talking about culture is ethnic identity and ethnocentrism. And there's another slide here on ethnocentrism, so hang in there with me. The book says strong ethnic identity is generally good. Having a strong sense of sort of your people, where you come from, is fine. That's a good thing. But if it's, we say generally good, if it is so strong that you look down on others, you see yourself as superior, everybody else is strange or weird, that is a real problem, right? And this brings about ethnocentrism. And ethnocentrism, in short, ethnocentrism is making your culture, right? It says centrism, right? Your culture is central. It's the center, and everybody else is out here, right? They're weird, they're odd because they're not here in the center where yours is at the center. They're outside the center, right? So they're weird, they're odd. That's ethnocentrism, right? That other cultures, other people who aren't like you are weird or odd. Now I want to talk about that for a moment using the figure from your book. So it talks about, at the most extreme end of ethnocentrism. And by the way, there is in your electronic version, you got to click on the next thing to see all this thing lay itself out. But there is disparagement, and that is that when you see other cultures, you belittle them. They're weird, they're strange, they're odd, right? And you don't want, they're bad, right? That's disparagement. So that's the most extreme case of ethnocentrism, as opposed to avoidance, which is, I'm not going to say it's bad, but don't make me deal with it, which means you obviously don't think it's all that great. So you're not going around belittling it or insulting it, but you don't want to have to deal with it, right? So that's avoidance. Versus indifference. You're like, I mean, I don't know, other people do other things, I don't know, I don't care. That's the sort of middle ground. It's indifference. It's not awful, I guess. You're not belittling other people from other cultures, but you are just only interested in your own and sort of dismissive of everybody else. That's indifference. And it's not great, honestly. And then we get to sensitivity, which is like, there are other people, other cultures, and they do other things. I'm sort of interested in that, or it's sort of interesting, it's sort of curious, or just, I know they do other things, and so I'm willing to like accommodate that, right? As opposed to then equality, which is really trying to understand and treat others as equals. So being sensitive is like at work, you're a supervisor and somebody has a religious holiday or a restriction, and you go, well, I'll try to sort of work around it. That's being sensitive. And equality is going, oh, right, like that seems fine. Like, just like I have some of my own things or whatever. So equality is really seeing you just being equal versus like, well, I mean, that's okay. We'll work with it, as opposed to equal, like, oh, yes, fine. I mean, it's one thing that goes on for me as a practicing Christian, I always say, is that, listen, all of my holidays are already on the calendar, right? And so, I never have to worry about whether or not culture is going to recognize my major holidays. They do. So part of sort of in terms of religion, the sort of equality in terms of issues of religion and ethnicity here is to say, like, yeah, I mean, to think about, to plan around, to anticipate other people having other holidays, and not to be like, oh, I guess if you have one coming up, I can work around it, but like being aware of it, anticipating, and it's work to get there. Okay. We're moving into communication competence, and I'm going to break this lecture into another part, and we're going to stop here for a moment. I'll see you in the next one.